Yayanar, or Duck Place, literally meant duck duck there. It was the name our family gave to Prophecy Creek Park. We went there regularly when I was a toddler because the entrance was just in our backyard, guarded by two towering trees. The entranceway was a narrow few-meter path filled with several different plants, which was just a taste of the actual park we were going to. After hacking our way through the dense foliage and coming through the brush, we were greeted by a sign that said, "No hunting, no dumping," in the middle of a wide open field. We walked at the field's side before going to the next field, whose entrance was once again flanked by two majestic oaks. The gate was quite gravelly, and I'd get a bunch of pebbles stuck in my little shoes, but I didn't care. I ran along far ahead of my family, before having to make a decision to go left or right. As I couldn't make a choice and was generally indecisive in going left or right, I just stood there as the rest of my family caught up and made the choice for me. Should we choose right, then we'd reach the creek, which didn't have a bridge to cross over. Father improvised by pulling some old logs into the creek, and Mother assisted by throwing some mossy rocks into there as well. We'd have a bridge, and Father, Mother, and my brother would cross it with ease. I was always the last to cross it, hesitant at first, wondering if the moss would make me slip and if the logs were decaying and unstable and would crumble under my weight. Father always laughed, crossed the creek again, and helped me over. Should we choose to go left, then we'd go through a tunnel of trees with the ground layer of decomposing leaves. The smell of new soil filled my nose, and I liked to get dirty by playing in those leaves. On the other side of the tunnel we had to cross the same creek, but there was a wooden bridge to go over. Father, Mother, and my brother crossed it with ease. I was always the last to cross it again, hesitantly wondering if the bridge would suddenly break and warning my family to cross one at a time. After everybody was over, I stepped tenderly on the bridge and crossed it. From there we'd be at the side of the smaller of the twin ponds. There was a small island in the middle, surrounded by water, grass, and ferns. I always wanted to reach that island, but there wasn't a bridge. We skirted the pond and soon were faced with another choice on whether to go forward or left. Should we have chosen to go left, well, there'd be yet another bridge. This time it was a stone bridge, but as usual I was afraid of it. Those stones seemed cracked, I thought, as Father, Mother, and my brother crossed it, ignoring my calls for them to cross one at a time. I planted my little feet lightly and walked across. At the other side, we'd be by the larger pond. Bass and other smaller fish swam around in the murky water, while mallard ducks dabbled on the surface that was covered with duckweed. Father and Mother would lie down on the tender grass, enjoying a soft breeze that even a pond could bring, while I played with my brother, which tended to end up in arguments and me crying. Mother would just giggle, knowing that it happens all the time. My brother and I knew it as well, and pretty soon my tears would turn into laughs as we bounced, tumbled, and rolled around on the moist grass in the fresh air. Should we have chosen to continue forward, we'd take a rest and sit down on a bench. Sometimes I took naps there because it was nice and shady, and my father would have to wake me up so we could continue. As we proceeded, there was a tree with a branch that jutted out of the trunk. Father would hoist me and my brother up, and we'd climb the tree as far up as possible, which usually ended up in a bunch of cuts, scrapes, and bruises for both of us. But we didn't mind, we were just innocent and carefree children. As we strolled towards the end of the larger pond, Father would always invite us to look at the pipe that connected the end of the larger pond with the creek. Sometimes the pipe was very active after rain, and other times during the dry summer no water went through that pipe at all. If we walked a little more after that past a group of cattails, well, what do you know? Another bridge. This bridge was painted green and was made of metal. I had a strange fondness of this bridge that contrasted with my fear of all the other bridges. I always had to cross this bridge first, never letting any other family member go before me. The bridge's walkway was an iron lattice, and it always clanked very loudly no matter how I walked across it. I enjoyed the noise, and oftentimes I'd just run on the bridge and back just to make the noise louder, much to the disdain of my parents. I had too much fun on the bridge, and my parents would stop me if I had gotten so excited that I jumped and stomped on the bridge, causing a great racket. As we continued, we turned to the right and meet the very same creek in the beginning. For some reason the logs and rocks disappeared, even though the current of the creek wasn't that strong. This happened every time my parents placed something in the creek to get across, almost as if this part of the creek didn't want to have a bridge. Anyway, after my parents rebuilt the makeshift bridge, they'd cross it along with my brother, and I carefully crossed it last. Sometimes I was so scared I just stopped on a log in the middle and wouldn't budge, so father would have to help me across. We started towards home, turning back towards the familiar fields and through the 2 trees that guarded the entrance before finally finishing our joyous outing in our backyard. That was then, a long, long time ago. We used to go there all the time, but as I grew older and life became more complex, my responsibilities increased. The free time I once had was now occupied by the burdens of school. Somehow I had recently managed to make some time and pay a visit to my old friend Prophecy Creek Park. From my backyard, I could still see the 2 proud trees protecting the entrance to the park. I crossed through the entranceway, which was no longer than it was before. However, it certainly seemed longer to get through, as the entrance was now overgrown with neglect and there was hardly a passage. After crossing through the entrance with difficulty, the sign was still there, warning the reader against hunting and dumping. I was relieved to find the fields unchanged, and turned right towards the creek. After so many years, nobody had built a bridge across it, probably because the spirit of the creek wouldn't allow it. I turned back, and went through the tunnel of trees before turning right to the wooden bridge for the same creek upstream. My irrational fear of bridges had long subsided, so I crossed the bridge with ease. I enjoyed my solitude as my family wasn't with me this time I went to the park. Brother's at college, father's rarely home, and mother's always too busy. I had expected this park to be a reliable place to be alone, and for now it was holding up. After crossing the bridge, I had arrived to see the familiar island. I was overjoyed to see there was a bridge to it this time, and the island was furnished with a bench and gazebo. But from the island I could see that the park had changed a lot. Now there was a stone passageway with lights, instead of the cracked stone bridge that separated the big and small ponds. I saw several small white chairs, and people coming in and out of a building. Evidently this place hosts weddings now, much to my displeasure. No wonder why they had developed this park that was once so natural. The larger pond now had fountains that seemed pretty nice, as it did clean up the murky water and duckweed. Now it's very clear. However, I felt something was missing. The fish were gone, and so were the ducks. I had expected to hear the song of birds and the quacks of the ducks, but that had been replaced by the constant artificial noise of the fountains, ending the peaceful silence of before. The large pond also used to be lined with several trees, especially around the old cracked stone bridge. Now they were cleared. I wanted to continue forward, but it seemed I wasn't welcome to cross through the wedding, which occupied the whole side of the large pond and defended its territory with a makeshift fence. I had no choice but to go back to the other side of the large pond. The bench I used to take naps on now was very dirty, cracked, and mossy. The tree where my father used to hoist my brother and me up to climb from the jutting branch now had that jutting branch chopped off. The tree's trunk now had a large wound on its side, exposing the several rings. I thought I saw a sad face on it. Thoroughly disappointed with the changes, I continued forward towards the end of the large pond. Even the pipe was gone, covered up by small levees that lined the edge of the pond. There was even a sign that warned against swimming and fishing that now was partially covered by the embankments. I walked past and saw a bunch of stones and gigantic lumps of dirt by the old red barn in the distance. There were 2 Caterpillar bulldozers, one orange and one yellow. They had already spoiled the beauty of the park, and they're still planning on developing even more of it. Feeling quite frustrated, I walked past the cattails and stomped with fury on the green metal bridge that was now thoroughly rusted. It made the familiar loud clanking sound, but I wasn't laughing anymore. However, as I was about to reach the other side of the spirited creek, I found a new sign that welcomed me to the Briar Hill Preserve. This Briar Hill Preserve wasn't here before, so out of curiosity I entered it. I saw a wooden bridge that was more of a plank because the creek below it had dried up. As I passed that, there was a very small brook that I could just cross with a step. Now I was faced with a decision to choose the trail that went left or right. I started left, and was surprised at the length of the trail and the untouched nature, only finding one piece of litter. The trail was rather narrow, and wound through dense forest before ending at a meadow, where I turned back and then chose the trail that went to the right. This trail had several trails branching off it, and I took them all, and all were seemingly untouched, as if I had been the only person ever to walk there. It was a surprise I didn't get lost in the countless trails there were, for I had fortunately taken a systematic approach to exploring the preserve. In the end, the main right trail also ended at the same meadow. As it was getting late and I had walked for hours, I only walked a little bit of the meadow before turning back and exiting the preserve. As I walked by the ponds of the park, the fountains had shut off, and there were some geese near the cattails. I accidentally stepped in their poop, but I felt too relieved to notice. I crossed the bridges and entered the final fields. As I walked through the entrance guarded by those 2 trees to my backyard and finally home, I realized that the park had not regressed, but had rather grown up, just like me. Now let's begin the analysis. Hooray! Just to get this out of the way, my story had way more than it needed to, but the final paragraph, which was the most important, would be completely out of context had I not included the rest of the story. That being said, don't treat the final paragraph as an end, because the entire story contributes to the meaning of the final paragraph that people who only read the end wouldn't understand. Notice how I capitalized some important words in the transcription. I started with capitalizing Briar Hill Preserve to emphasize the setting of the description. I then capitalized bridge, because you've probably heard I mention bridges several times throughout the story, because they are an important motif. Similar to E.B. White's Once More to the Lake, my story's central theme is related to time as well, so the bridge is a symbol of the past, present, and future. Crossing the bridge would mean willing to go forward, but I was often unwilling to in the beginning. I was stuck in the past and wanted to keep my picture of the park the same. Another recurring topic in the story was making decisions. I was also often indecisive when I was young, showing my failure in both to make a decision to move forward and then act on it by crossing by myself. I also capitalized surprised, because it showed the true moment in which my mood began to improve, and I began to appreciate the changes. I'd capitalized dried somewhere before to show that I was still grouchy and focusing on the negative. I also capitalized narrow and wound to pay homage to my narrow-mindedness and indecisive nature before my realization at the end. Similarly, the branches of the trails reflects the complex thoughts that were going through my head at the time I was there, battling between my newfound appreciation of the park versus my disappointment in how the park failed to remain the same as I wanted it to be. That is, when I was young. In the end, my open-mindedness won out and defeated its foe in the fight, thus likening to the open expanse of the meadow at the end of the Briar Hill Preserve. I emphasized the lateness as a realization of how much time has already passed, similar to E.B. White. After leaving the preserve to go home, I passed the shut-off fountains, reinforcing my appreciation of the new park and giving me a sense of relief. With all this, you can now probably accurately predict the purpose of my story, which is revealed at the end. It is to expect change, and as cliché as it may sound, don't be stuck in the past, because time certainly can't freeze, so why should you? You also notice that my story had 3 dominant impressions, one for each part, being cheerful, disappointed, and then reconciliatory. These dominant impressions of each part of my story connect together to support the purpose, showing the reconciliation between my cheerful and disappointed sides after accepting that both the park and me have changed. My use of the language of imagery affected my dominant impression, as I gave different views of the same park to achieve different impressions, which then united into the purpose. Although I described the same thing, the descriptions were done differently between when I was young and when I was older. This primarily came to be because I used different vantage points. When I was small, I had a near and intimate view on the park, as I went there regularly as a toddler, but when I was older that view became far and detached, as I had lost contact with the park for a long time. That is, I haven't been there for a while. The near and intimate view tended to give more objective descriptions as I was close enough to see how things actually were, compared to my subjective descriptions when I was far and detached. Because I couldn't see things clearly, I had to make guesses and interpretations that were often influenced by my opinions on the park's changes. Finally, I organized my story into 3 distinct parts, with each having their own dominant impression. Organization was key because I had to have the correct dominant impressions so they could interact, as in a reconciliation between cheerful and disappointed, and achieve the purpose of my story. Oh, and if you really want to know, the song I used was an excerpt from the Backstreet Boys' I Want It That Way. Don't overthink it. I just thought it fit because I wanted the park that way, as in the way it used to be.
Another thing, stone.